right, we're going to continue today with printing. We talked about dyeing, but we will mention a couple of different types of dyes again with printing. So the difference between dyeing and printing is that in printing, you are applying the color to a certain section of the fabric, and usually it's on the surface. You're not dyeing the entire fabric, you're not dipping the whole fabric into some kind of dye, and it's a little bit different. But we are still using dyes to print, of course. There are a lot of different kinds of printing. There's foam printing, wet printing, pigment printing, and so on. So this is a direct printing where the color is applied directly on a certain location on the garment, textile, fabric, or whatever you're printing. There are direct printing methods where you use a block. So this is almost like stamping. So you can have a carved wood block and you dip that into the dye paste, and then you put that on top of the fabric so that, I mean, it is pretty much like stamping. So you have a stamp and you dip it in there. Roller printing is where you are using rollers which are etched with a design, and the rollers pick up the paste and press it onto the fabric. So it's kind of like stamping, except the stamp is basically the roller, and it just rolls on a roll of fabric and prints it on. I will show you some pictures later on, so it will make a lot more sense to see these different type of printing methods. Duplex print is when you have a print, different print on either side of the fabric. Warp print is when you print the warp yarns before you go into weaving. So you have your warp yarns prepared to do to make some woven fabric, and you print on the surface of those warp yarns, and then when you make the fabric with them, you get this kind of hazy pattern. This is a good picture of roller printing. So your fabric is coming down and you have those rollers. Each of these rollers are applying a different color onto the fabric surface. So for example, the first roller picks up the red color, and this is a blade. So this cylinder kind of turns around the red color and takes the color to this cylinder, and the blade helps the color, be on the surface. And then, it's an engraved roller. So when the roller hits the fabric, the design is printed on the fabric. And then on this design, you have 3 different colors, so each roller is applying a different color onto the fabric. Discharge print is basically you are, instead of printing and applying a color, you are removing a color from the garment. So for example, you have a black t-shirt and you're using bleach to remove the black in certain areas, creating a design. So that would be a discharge print. This is a good example. This is a denim fabric, and in these spots, you are bleaching and removing that indigo color on the fabric. So you get those white spots. This is a discharge print. This is a screen print. So screen printing uses these wooden frames, and you create your design and stretch it on the wooden frame. And whatever your design is, it may be a picture, it may be words, then you're going to use some kind of dye paste, and the paste will be spread across with some kind of blade. But in your screen, your design is blocked. I mean, your screen is actually blocking the color from penetrating into the fabric, but only in the design areas. So with screen printing, you can actually print only one color at a time, because each screen will have the areas. For example, if you're doing yellow, then in your design, only the yellow areas will be open on this screen. Everything else will be blocked. So when you just try to smear that yellow paste onto the fabric, you just go over that screen and only the areas where it's supposed to be yellow is open, so the color only penetrates through those spots onto your fabric, so you get that yellow color. And then you have to remove that screen, put a new screen if you need to apply other colors in there. There's flat screen where it's for shorter yardages. So in this case here, whatever you're printing is underneath that screen. It may be a t-shirt, it may be a fabric. But if you are doing yardage of fabric and trying to print that, then you can use the same concept, but use a rotary screen where your screen is basically on a cylinder. This is an example of a screen printing. So if you're trying to apply this print on the fabric, and this has these flowers in brown, and then there are these green colors. So you're going to put the screen to first do your brown colors, and then you're going to put the screen back to do your green color. Of course, you know, the dark green is going to be separate screen, the light green is going to be a separate screen, and so on. So this is how screen printing works. This is heat transfer. Heat transfer uses, we actually have this in our lab, so we can actually do that. You can create your design and print it on a transfer paper, and then you use the paper and you press that onto your t-shirt, and the ink from the paper is going to transfer onto the t-shirt with heat. So this is heat transfer, but there's also digital printing or inkjet printing, which works just like a regular printer. And instead of printing on paper, you're printing on fabric or textiles. There's the electrostatic printing, where you use a dye that is in powder form, and it gets heat fixed onto the fabric surface with heat. There's differential printing, especially for cross dyeing. These are really good methods. There is foil print, there's stencil print. Stencil is basically you're using a stencil to print on your material. There are a lot of developments in the printing technologies. There are metals used as dyes. Sometimes people combine dyeing and printing together. There are computer applications where you can make it very efficient. You can create really nice designs and print it very easily. There are different kind of pigments that people are developing. There are nanoparticles used to print smart textiles and so on. So there are a lot of different methods. Now I'm going to talk a little more about color fastness. And then I will talk more about printing techniques from your iTextiles, because it has some good pictures where you can picture how it is done. Now, color fastness is one of the properties of fibers and textiles. We talked about this very early on in the semester. So when we have, I'm going to give you an example of a red sweatshirt. So when you have a red sweatshirt and you keep laundering it, washing it in the washing machine, and you realize the red is losing the shade, it's fading over time. In that case, we usually say this sweatshirt doesn't have good color fastness. So color fastness is a property of a fabric to keep the colors on itself. And it's very important when you're dyeing or printing, because it's all about adding colors to the textile. So colors may change because of perspiration, because of so many other reasons. These are a list of reasons where you will lose color on your fabric, on your textile. Washing will fade the color sometimes. Dry cleaning, perspiration, sunlight exposure, water, seawater, especially with some materials. Bleach will make you lose color. Fumes and pollution, certain solvents used in dry cleaning or crocking, kind of like just rubbing the fabric and crocking the fabric. So all of those will cause color issues, color losses. Color fastness is related to the chemistry of the fibers and how well the dyes and pigments are penetrating into the fabric or bonding with the fibers, and you will have color issues if there's not a very strong bond with the fibers and dyes, or if the dye didn't penetrate really well. There are also other issues, so I'm going to talk a little bit about color problems. One problem is bleeding. So this is when one thing that you have starts to bleed its color. So for example, you wash your red sweater in the washing machine and you have a couple white t-shirts in the mix, and then you take them out and you realize your white t-shirts are kind of pink, you know, it's no longer white, or your red sweater is bleeding into these white t-shirts, so it's losing the color because of the water, and it's getting on other things. Crocking is the transfer of the color to another fabric because you're rubbing those fabrics together. Migration is color movement to other areas of the garment or the textile. Fading is color loss because of perspiration, because of gas fumes, sunlight, and so on. Tendering is losing the strength of the fabric. So this is not about color loss, this is more about strength loss on the fabric because of coloring. So you may have dyed this fabric at this high temperature, but the chemicals from the dye weakens your fabric. So that's called tendering. Frosting is you are losing color in the areas of the fabric where you have a lot of abrasion. Out of register is when the print colors overlap. This is something that will happen a lot with screen printing as well. So if your screens are not perfectly aligned when you are doing different colors, then your print is going to be out of register. So it won't be aligned. Or your colors will overlap, or you will miss the exact areas. Off grain is another problem when you're printing, because if your print is not straight on the grain, it will just look off, and this is usually a defect. Production matching problems also is an issue. For example, you know, if you're making those red sweaters, you have to order a lot of fabrics. And if you're making 10,000 of those sweaters, you have to order so many rolls of fabric. So when you order a new roll, it's dyed in the factory at a different time, and the shade sometimes doesn't match from one roll to the other. So this will usually be an issue if you are producing the garments and you need to have a specific shade of red and you can't get that, you know, that's usually a problem. Sometimes there are matching problems in the same roll of fabric. You know, sometimes the fabric, the red shade is different from one side of the fabric to the other side of the fabric. So it's called the side-to-side matching problem. Or the fabric roll, like the color is fine until you get to, I don't know, the 15th yard of the fabric in the roll, and the color starts to fade. So that's the side to center. Or color doesn't match at the ends of the roll or at the end of the bolt, and then you have to separate those because you can't use them. This is an issue of bleeding here. So this jacket, because of perspiration, there was some bleeding of the colors here. This was a beverage spill, and some of the black colors were stained with the beverage colors. So this is a migration example. This is a women's silk skirt, and this color loss is caused by hairsprays. So you have to be careful with your hairsprays, not sprayed on your sensitive garments like a silk garment, even though this is probably one of the ugliest skirts I've seen, but you will get some kind of color loss if you have different types of chemicals sprayed on your textiles. This silk shirt has lost color. This is the original color, but the color was lost because of dry cleaning. This is a blouse made of acetate and rayon, and they spilled alcohol here. This is the alcohol from the hairspray, and it stained the garment. This is a color loss because of sunlight exposure. So this is the original color, and this is after the fading. This is the magnified view of this jacket's colors, or I think it's a dress. So they were able to get this color from inside the pockets, because inside the pockets, they didn't get a lot of sunlight exposure, so the color didn't fade as much. But you can see on the rest of the dress, it has turned into a much lighter color. This is a good example of bleeding. So the black binding on this dress, the black color from the binding started bleeding into the white, and you can see this kind of color problem. This is academic regalia, the hood that people wear at graduation, and that faded color because of gas fumes. If you guys remember when we talked about acetate, we mentioned that acetate is very sensitive to pollution and gas fumes, and it will fade in color. So you can see the original color versus the discoloration from fumes. These pants were actually this brown color, and it totally turned into a green color after dry cleaning. So this was supposed to be washed, not dry cleaned, and the dry cleaning solvents faded the color. This is a staining issue, almost like bleeding, you know. So these collars are made out of leather, and the color on the leather kind of bled into the necklines, and you know, because of the dry cleaning solvents or washing, whatever they did here. Okay, so this is all I have about printing. So let's just go to your iTextiles. iTextiles has some nice pictures and information here. So I kind of want to go over this as well to summarize what we have talked about, and there are maybe some things that I have missed. So we talked about textile printing, you know, which is basically applying a dye or pigment. So it categorized printing into hand printing and mechanized printing, and I talked about this. Hand printing includes block printing, batik, tie-dye, ikat or ikat, hand screen transfer printing, and so on. So these are done by hand. I talked about batik and ikat in dyeing, but we're going to talk a little bit more about them. Mechanized printing is where you use rollers or rotary screens, heat transfer methods, digital printing, and other methods where it's more efficient. You're doing usually bigger amounts of printing, or you're using yardage. It's not just small amounts of materials or t-shirts or little garments. We talked about block printing, batik, tie-dye, and ikat. I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. I did mention them under dyeing. And we talked about block printing. This is like stamping. So you have a stamp which is carved out of wood, and you dip it in the dye, and then you stamp it on the fabric to create the design. So your design is usually as big as your wooden block or your stamp, and it's repeated throughout the fabric. So you're going to see the same design everywhere across the fabric. You just keep printing it with that block. Tie-dye is a resist printing method, and resist printing, I can't remember if I just mentioned resist printing, but this is where you are trying to prevent the penetration of the colors into certain sections of the textile. So you can tie the fabric for that to prevent it. This is tie-dye. So tie-dye is a resist printing method because you're trying to prevent the dye from penetrating into areas by tying them. They use them for traditional textiles in certain countries. And we usually use cellulosic fabrics because they have a better dye absorption. Cotton, rayon, silk, those type of fabrics are great for tie-dyeing. And you can knot the fabric in areas and then you dye it, but when you open up the sections that you tied really tightly, you see that the dye didn't penetrate into those sections and you create a design that way. There are other ways of resist printing where you're trying to prevent the dye from going in. And I will talk about it if we come across a picture. This is tie-dyeing by the shibori technique. This is a Japanese technique. So they are basically creating the design by winding long pieces of fabric around the pole, and then they wrap it with thread and scrunch that wrapped fabric and then dye it. And then you get this kind of design on the fabric. So this is a different technique of tie-dyeing. Ikat, ikat, in the US, it's called ikat. In British English, they call it ikat. This is a resist printing method as well. So you are basically tie-dyeing the yarns before you weave the fabric. So in this case, you get that hazy looking design. These are warp yarns that are tie-dyed for ikat, and then they're going to make the woven fabric out of this. So that will create some kind of pattern. Double ikat is when you have both your warp yarns and your filling yarns tie-dyed before the weaving process. Now, this is the actual ikat design. So this is you are tie-dyeing the warp yarns and then making the fabric. So you can see on each yarn, you have these color changes on single yarns. But in this picture, this is kind of a fake ikat. This is just printed on the fabric. So this is your base fabric, and you're printing this design on the fabric to make it look almost like an ikat design, okay? So this is actual ikat print, and this is a regular print done on a fabric in the ikat style. In batik, I did talk about batik, but I'll just remind you because we're summarizing here. You are creating a design, and then wherever you want the colors, you want to keep those open, but everywhere else where you don't want the color to penetrate, you are applying a hot wax to the fabric, and you're preventing the colors from penetrating into that areas where the wax is, and you get a nice color. So in a real batik fabric, you'll see cracks of color where the wax cracked and the color penetrated a little bit. So I can see it here a little bit. And we usually do batik on cotton and silk fabrics, maybe rayon as well, because those are good with that kind of print. This is another batik example. So we have that design, and then you apply the wax in all of these areas where you don't want the colors to penetrate, and you use a brush to do this, and then you apply the colors. So on a fabric, you have to trace the design on the fabric, then apply the wax, and then dye it. And then let it penetrate for a while, hang it up, and then once it's done, you have to remove all the wax from the fabric, and you can actually recycle and use the wax again later. So this is kind of how people do batik. I mean, you can do that at home. Screen printing is basically a stencil printing, because you're using this screen as a stencil. And you have your paste. So this is your print paste. This is your color. And this is a squeegee or a blade. And you're going to just spread that color across. the screen and your fabric is underneath the screen. So you're trying to get the color onto your fabric. This is a flatbed hand screen printing. So this is your fabric. And again, in this design, every single color has to be printed with a separate screen because you're putting the screen, you're applying a different color. So you have to spread that color on, let it dry, and then place the screen again and make it aligned perfectly with the previous design. And now you're gonna do another color. So each screen is gonna be different for each color. You can see here, like this is the color they're applying, that green color. So your design has that here. And this part of the fabric only has like all of these colors done, but not that background color. So here you're doing the background color with that green background and applying it on the fabric. We talked about mechanized printing, roller printing, screen printing, heat transfer, and so on. I'll just show you some pictures. This is a roller printing example on a knit fabric. So this design is printed on the surface. You can see that you don't see that in the back. So to create your print paste, you usually use a water-soluble base and the yellow pigment paste to do screen printing. This is another flatbed screen printing, more mechanized. So in this case, this giant thing is your squeegee, and this is your screen. So that's the paste that you're spreading onto the fabric. So the fabric is on the bottom. Rotary screen printing. This is a very common printing method. And in this case, you're instead of using those flat screens, you're using a rotary, which works like a screen. So I'm going to show you some pictures and it will make more sense. But in this case, again, to align your design on the fabric for each color, sometimes we use registry marks, and registry marks are helping you're going to see those on the selvage of the fabric on the very edge. So they help you align your design on the fabric. And I mean, with those, you can use a lot of different dyes. We talked about different kinds of dyes. So reactive dyes, wet dyes, pigments, you can use all of those. This is the rotary screen. So basically, this round thing is your screen. So if you go inside this, in the inside, this is your paste. There's a blade or a squeegee inside. And these rollers are turning, and as they turn, this blade is smearing the color onto the fabric that is passing through these rollers. Okay, so as the fabric is passing through, the colors are being applied by each of these cylinders onto the fabric. We talked about transfer, heat transfer printing, and so on. This is good for polyester fabrics especially. This is a heat transfer printer. So this is basically like a regular printer, but it is fabric that's coming out, and you're using heat to transfer colors onto the fabric. You can also do that with the transfer paper. So the heat transfer we have in our lab, you can use them. You can actually go buy transfer paper, and you can buy it in any store. We have it at Kilcawley Center. So you can buy the transfer paper, and you can create your design that you want to print on your t-shirt, for example, and you're going to get it printed on that transfer paper. And then you place the transfer paper on top of your t-shirt where you want the design, and you press that heat transfer thing. And it heats up your t-shirt so much that the transfer paper transfers all the ink from that design onto the fabric surface. And then when you take it out, the paper doesn't have a lot of those colors anymore on it. It's transferred to the fabric. So I think there's a mistake on this. It should be pre-printed paper, I believe. And this is the fabric after printing. And your paper will no longer have like those bright colors on it because it's all transferred onto the fabric. Digital printing is probably, you know, one of the easiest ways to print. It's a computerized system, so you can print a photograph, a picture on a fabric with digital printing. This is a good example. So this is like a printer, except you feed it fabric, and you can just create any design on a computer and just send it to the printer. These upholstery fabrics are all done by digital printing. So you create that design and digitally print. Okay, so this is printing. We'll talk a little bit about some of the terminology I didn't mention. Obviously, applied prints means like you have applied the colors onto the fabric. So block printing, roller printing, screen printing, rotary screen, those are all applied prints. When you use steam and water to treat the printed fabric, we call it a wet print. Or if you're using pigment paste, we call it a pigment print. This is an applied print where you have a white background and the color is applied on that white background. This is the face of the fabric. This is the back of the fabric. This is a blotch print where you have the background also printed to a color. And if you look at the wrong side of the fabric, you can see some of the white areas where that black color didn't quite penetrate all the way. So that's a blotch print. Overprint is when you have a fabric that's already dyed. So in this case, this fabric is dyed to a light blue color, and then you print on it. That's called an overprint. But you usually have to use a light colored background and use darker colors to do the printing. This face back. The clarity of the print on the back of the fabric will vary based on the type of fabric you're using. So on a sheer fabric, for example, your design on the face, the print on the face may show up on the back. But in this case, for example, you know, thicker fabrics, tightly constructed fabrics, or certain type of fabrics, whatever you print on the surface is not going to be visible on the back. Duplex print is when you have a print on both sides, both face and the back of the fabric. We talked about warp prints and foil prints. We talked about discharge prints where you are removing color. This is a discharge print. So the fabric is actually black, but you are removing the black in these areas, creating this pinkish design. This is the face of the fabric. This is the back. We talked about the repeating unit is which pattern you are repeating on the entire fabric. Pattern direction is important because when you have your fabric, you know, you have your grain direction. Which way are you going to put your pattern? There are one-way patterns, two-way patterns, multi-directional patterns. So it's basically about the direction of the motifs. If you have all motifs facing one direction, it's a one-way pattern. If they're facing two opposite directions, it's a two-way pattern. So in this case, it's a two-way pattern because the design is kind of facing both ways. This is a one-way pattern. So those feathers are not going the other way, right? They're all in this one direction. This is a multi-directional pattern. This is a print defect because of off-grain print. So you can see the print here is vertical, but the grain is off, right? So that's a defect. That's another defect because there's a faded look on the fabric. This is actually a good one. This is a bad one. So here, the bottom ones are the magnified views. So here you can see the edges on these printed colors, like the white is more sharp, but on this one the edges are blurred, so it's a faded look. It can be a defect. In this one, the defect is that the registry marks are off, right? So if the pattern was aligned perfectly, then the numbers would be inside those registry marks. So this is called out of register or off register print. This defect is caused by the creases on the fabric. So the fabric was either creased or wrinkled and the color didn't go through all the way. So that's a defect. This one, especially in this section here, it was either some kind of yarn that was stuck on here, or something blocked the colors from going through perfectly. This is a bleeding issue, so you can see the colors are kind of bleeding through. Okay. Now I'm going to show you guys a video, and I want you to really watch this because it's very interesting, and you guys can use these methods to dye your own garments naturally. And for your textile kit substitute project, you can also do this, because I want you guys to create something with textiles, and this is also something you can try to do with your fabrics. And I'm just going to play this. So for example, you take those pennies and you put water, and the copper bleeds into the water, and then you can dye your garments with that and get a blue color. So there are some really cool videos. I put that video on your useful links on Blackboard, so you can watch this. So in this case, they're using grapes to get this color. Turmeric is a perfect colorant because it stains your garments if it gets to you. But if you mix it with baking soda, it actually gives you a nice color. This one is using rosemary, and you get a yellowish color with you. Of course, you know, in this video, the colors are, I think, too bright. I don't think you will get such bright colors, but using hot water, sometimes using baking soda helps. You know, in this case, they used vinegar. In this case, they're using baking soda, and they're getting different colors, okay? So all these different extra elements add a different color to your garment. So in this case, they're using logwood and hot water, and that is creating a purplish color. Eucalyptus leaves, you can use those with hot water. So generally, you have to use a cellulosic fabric that can withstand the heat. Blackberry is a perfect one. You know, blackberry will give you really nice colors. These are all natural dyes, so none of these are chemical dyes, and you can definitely use them on your garments. Now, because you're using heat, you really don't want to use synthetic or thermoplastic materials. Like a polyester material might melt with heat, so you don't want to do that. So if you have a faded black pair of jeans, you can add coffee to it to create a little deeper colors. This is a good bleeding example. The red has blood into all these t-shirts. So to get rid of that redness or pinkness, you can boil it in hot water with lemons, and that will give you a whiter t-shirt. So I think these videos are interesting. It gives you some ideas. And you know, if you do use one of these methods on your material that you create for that textile kit project, then I will accept it. Okay. So I wanted you guys to see, you know, avocado gives you a nice pink color, actually, if you boil the avocado with water and then use that water to dye your fabric. Okay, this is basically it. We are done with printing.